Hi, everyone, and welcome. We'll wait just a couple of minutes to let everyone into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final talk in our fall series on migrations. I'm Eleanor Painter, postdoctoral associate here in migrations. And on behalf of myself and Wendy Wolford, who you've seen here in past weeks giving you this welcome, I'd like to thank you for joining us today and also for having joined us throughout the semester. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us each week for these lectures and to think with you as we've heard about migrations across disciplines, species, geographies, and time periods. Today, we're thrilled to round out our fall series with this lecture on climate change, migration, and human adaptation. And before I hand it over to Vanessa Olguin, who will introduce our speakers, I just wanted to take a moment to let you know what we have coming up in the spring. So you can hold this in mind and keep our website on in your bookmarks. This spring, our series will take the theme Reimagining Citizenship. And so we'll have a series of talks, readings, and roundtables reflecting on belonging, exclusion, and ways of practicing citizenship and community that enact social and racial justice. Continuing in the spirit of this fall series, we'll be thinking about these issues across species and world regions and through the lenses of a variety of disciplines. We'll start in February 11th at noon is our first event with a panel on paths to citizenship under the new administration. And then over the course of the spring semester, we'll also be hearing from colleagues in ornithology, science and technology studies, and guests in political science, literature, and visual art. We'll also be hosting a migrations film series, and information about all of these events will be available on our website. So stay tuned for details there. And one more thing before we get started, I'd really like to thank all the people who have made this fall series a success. So many thanks to our production team who've been working behind the scenes each week, Donna Wilsinski and Priyanka Chakravarti, Jessica Ames, who set up a lot of the architecture of this series, and our communications team who've done really amazing work in advertising the series, but also in making it available to everyone. So if you go to our website now, you'll see that if you've missed a talk or would like to rewatch one, many of them are available to view now on the website. And of course, a special thanks to our students. A great group of students have reflected deeply on each week's topics and lectures and have brought their excellent questions to our presenters. So thanks to all of you. And one of these students is Vanessa Olguin, who's a Cornell College scholar and a migration studies minor. I know she's also especially focused on questions of climate migration. And so we're very glad to have her here to introduce today's speakers. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you, Eleanor. Hello, everyone. My name is Vanessa Olguin, and I'm a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm an interdisciplinary college scholar major and a government major, and I'm pursuing a minor in migration studies. Today, for the last migrations lecture of this semester, I'm excited to introduce Professor Filiz Garip and Professor Nancy Chau. Professor Garip is a professor in the Department of Sociology here at Cornell. She serves as the director of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society, and her research interests are centered around migration, economic sociology, and inequality, examining specifically the mechanisms that enable or constrain mobility and lead to greater or lesser degrees of social and economic inequality. Professor Garip has had several articles published in Population and Development Review, The Washington Post, and other outlets, and she's also a consulting editor for the American Journal of Sociology and Sociological Science. She's also the author of the book On the Move, Changing Mechanisms of Mexico-U.S. Migration, published in Princeton University Press, and which has also received several awards, including the Best Book Award of the American Political Science Association's Migration and Citizenship section. And interestingly enough, Professor Garip also has a bachelor's in industrial engineering. Nancy Chau is professor of economics and area coordinator of applied economics and policy at the Dyson School in the S.C. Johnson College of Business. She's a senior fellow at the Center for Development Research and a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. Professor Chau's research focuses on several areas of international trade, regional economics, and economic development. Professor Chau was awarded the Alexander von Humboldt Research Fellowship and the first T.W. Schultz Award of the International Agricultural Economics Association, as well as the SUNY Award for Excellence in Teaching. Her research on labor markets and developing economies has received funding, for example, from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and the Center for Economic Policy Research. Recently, Professor Garip, Professor Chau, and Professor Ariel Ortiz-Bobea at the Dyson School were awarded a grant from the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability to establish linkages between gradual weather changes over the last 50 years and migration patterns from Mexico to the United States. Within the Migrations Initiative, their team has also been awarded a 2020 Migrations Grant to similarly explore how weather fluctuations impact migration decisions. Climate change is forecasted to increase the prevalence of extreme environmental events, including droughts, floods, and development, the violation and disruption of human rights, as well as increased international conflicts and border fortification, and heightened xenophobia and nationalism in migrant-receiving countries. Climate-driven migration has recently received more and more attention in migration literature, and Professor Chau and Professor Garip's project through the Migrations Grant is extremely important in questioning our default models of migration and exploring how our climate can influence one's decision to migrate. As someone who has focused their major specifically on the issue of climate change and migration in Latin America, I'm especially interested and excited for the work that Professor Chau and Professor Garip will share with us today. I would like to remind everyone watching that there will be time for questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A function that is located at the bottom of the Zoom webinar window. And without further ado, Professor Garip and Professor Chau.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for that wonderful introduction. And I just wanted to start by thanking the Wendy, as well as the other organizers of this wonderful seminar series. I think we've all learned a lot during the semester. I also want to thank you for the introduction, invitation to participate, for Filiz and I to participate in this seminar. So what we're going to be doing today is to present some of our work on climate change and migration that we've been working on recently. Filiz and I will be splitting the time between us, I think around 50-50. And so, so just to get us started, let me start by sharing our screen here. So let's see. I think this works. So let me make this. I'm sorry. Let me go back to view. Sorry, what happened here? Okay, once again. Okay, so the topic, of course, is on migration, climate change, and adaptation. And so since there'll be two different parts of this talk, I thought it would be nice to maybe just start by orienting ourselves and thinking about, migration and climate change, first of all, as kind of two quite different, right, research topics to start, and to see how, in the end, these two things are really intimately related to one another. And so starting from a migration perspective, I started, I think, when I first came to Cornell, I started as an international and migration scholar. And my view about, international migration looks something like this, right? So I know that many of you have been listening to talks on migration related to other types of migration, such as oceanic migration, for example. And so maybe it might be nice to just start with some facts and to see the size and shape of the problem. And so the total stock of international migrants globally, as estimated by the UN, is around 272 million. And so this is a stock figure. So at any point in time in the year 2019, there are 272 million international migrants in the world. And of course, these are quite different across different regions in the world, where Europe has the largest number of international migrants, followed by North America, and then followed by North Africa and Western Asia. As migration scholars, we tend to ask questions that sound like this, right? We're interested in the push and pull impacts, right? What are the determinants of migrants, of migration flows, conditional on migration, right? What is the impact of such migration flow on host countries? What is the impact of such migration flow on sending countries? And furthermore, what is the impact of these migration flow on the individual migrants as well as their households? Right, so if we think about, well, so where does climate change fit into this long-standing migration literature, right? One way to look at it would be to say that, well, climate change is really just another push factor of migration. And the bonus here is that it is exogenous. And so in one of the most highly cited climate migration paper, it uses precisely this fact, right? That in fact, climate change allows us, right, to think about and understand how other sources of variations, other shocks, right, impact migration flows. And here, right, the well-known figure of 6.7 million, right, denotes the effect of climate-driven changes in crop yields on the rate of emigration to the United States from Mexico. Right, so from a migration point of view, climate change is an exogenous kind of a push factor, as typically thought of. But what about from a climate change perspective? Right, so just switching focus just a little bit here, and here I have some kind of estimates of climate change migrants in the world as well. And these come from the World Bank recently. And so about 145 million people by the year 2050 would become climate change migrants in 3 regions of the world alone. So essentially doubling the total worldwide, almost doubling the total worldwide a number of international migrants, right? And so most of these migrants will originate from sub-Saharan Africa and followed by Latin America and then followed by South Asia. In the climate change literature, we ask a number of other questions, right? Where the impact on human activities is just one of these questions. We also ask questions on the impact of on biodiversity, natural environment, on agriculture, as well as on markets. And so some of my colleagues in the College of Business, is talking about a brand new field called climate finance. And so asking then the question of the role of human migration in climate change literature, right? What is it, right? So why are we interested in human migration in this large climate change literature per se? Well, as it turns out, I think one way to think about it is that migration helps us think about, right, contextualize the impact of climate change and the accommodating policies. Right? It helps us to understand because 1 degree increase in the temperature, right? What does it mean to us, and so on. So having migration in the story is helpful. And so a useful example I think to give is that in the same World Bank report where this 145 million people figure has been given, right, that the following other scenarios has also been given as well. It says that in the more inclusive development scenario, internal migration across the 3 regions could drop to 60 to 100 million. And in the more climate-friendly scenario, we project the fewest internal migrants, right? And so in essence, including human migration into the story, allow us to think about, it imputes values, it adds body counts to exactly what does climate change mean. Right, so similar to that, right? The 2 parts of today's lecture, I think can be seen in this way as well. So we'll start with using human migration to understand the risk of weather hazards. And so in my presentation, I'll be looking at how migrants actually strategically choose weather-wise hazardous entry points into host countries, right, in response to spatial heterogeneity and border rewards. And so border enforcement. And so depending on how border enforcement is situated, right, migrants actually can sometimes choose strategically hazardous entry points. And in particular, right, I will be talking a little bit more about how border sectors with negative selection, right? So in fact, it is the poorer migrants who select these migration locations with the highest risk-reward profiles. And so Filiz will be talking about the other side of looking at migration and climate change relationship as well, where climate change shocks can be used to understand human migration. Here, the nuances are interesting as well, but I'm not going to give any more spoilers, and I'll let Filiz tell her story. And so let me just move on here. The content of the paper that I'm going to talk about is actually a joint paper between the 3 of us, myself, Filiz, as well as Ariel, a colleague of mine at the Dyson school. And so the topic of this particular paper is on the triggers of hazardous border crossings using evidence from the US and Mexican border. And so here, just to get started, here I have a picture of the US and Mexico border, where, it's about 2,000 miles long. It stretches all the way from the beaches of San Diego through the desert of Tucson, Arizona, all the way to the Rio Grande. Here I also indicated a weather heat map where you can see different types of climate patterns, where, of course, the reddest part indicates I think the most difficult location through which to cross the border, which is Tucson, Arizona. And the reason why we're interested in this particular problem is that, as we know, there is a humanitarian crisis at the border. We know that migrants are increasingly choosing, right, dangerous border crossing. And the question is why. So some figures to start. Worldwide, there are about 75,000 migrant deaths since 1998. The US and Mexican border takes a big chunk of that 75,000, about 10,000, between the years 1994 to 2019. The question that we want to ask in this paper is, what are the triggers of these dangerous migrant border crossings? As we know, the very different, right, heterogeneous physiography across the US-Mexican border is a long-standing feature, something that we know and something that migrants know well. The question that we want to ask is, why is there a drastic rise in migrant deaths in recent years? And so this is not, of course, entirely a new topic to study. In fact, there are, and one can think about multiple sources of shocks that might have coincided with this increasing migrant death as well. And so the question is, can we figure out which one is the more important one? Right, so here I list a few of them. The first one would be, in fact, the most highly cited one is host country enforcement reforms. And during this period of analysis between 1980 to 2005, there are two major border operations called Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line, where the U.S. government is putting increasing border enforcement in the San Diego border crossing, so that that used to be the most popular crossing area. What is less mentioned in the literature is sending country macroeconomic shocks such as the peso crisis. Climate change would be one of the reasons as well as other shocks to the livelihoods of the individual workers in Mexico, such as entry into GATT, entry into NAFTA, and so on. So which one of all of these shocks contributed to the migrant deaths along the border is something that we would like to discuss today. And of course, as I mentioned before, host country enforcement reform is one of, I think, the most commonly thought of reasons why people moved. And so some studies have been done in this area, specifically using Border Patrol budget, manpower, fencing, or combinations of these as triggers. Two outcome variables, including crossing deterrence, so the overall a smaller number of migrants crossing the border, or crossing displacement, namely people are going to cross anyway, you're just going to switch, right? You're just going to move them to a different border crossing area. All right, so what we will focus on in this paper, in addition to these border enforcement measures, include individual level characteristics, such as, right, the education level of the migrants, right? Do I expect high income or a high earning potential in my origin location? Community level characteristics, such as any permanent or idiosyncratic income shocks to the location. What we will find is, what we want to be able to see is whether or not there is systematic positive or negative selection of migrants in selected locations. In other words, do we observe in the more dangerous areas, such as Tucson, Arizona, is it negatively selecting migrants? Are the poorer migrants, right, more likely to be selected to cross in these locations? And being able to understand these questions allow us to rethink how we think about enforcement, as opposed to reactive, such as I would just enforce the locations where there are more migrants crossing the location. We can start thinking about more proactive border enforcement designs, whereby we can start saying, well, such negative economic shocks that have occurred, we should therefore anticipate these type of migrants to start crossing the border in these locations. Right, which, as we know, so far, the mortality impact has been quite disproportionate. Right, so with that said, so I want to give you just a look at how my data set looks like. And so this is the Mexican migration project data that we use for this analysis. It has information on origins of the migrants, destination of the migrants, and where they cross. And if someone is just a distance maximizer migration cost minimizer, you will simply be, drawing a straight line through these 2 points, and then that will be how you migrate. But as it turns out, as you can see here, migrants are choose very different migrant crossing patterns. And so the question is why? And so this paper has 2 parts. It contains a theory which talks about how migrants actually balance sector-specific reward profiles and the cost of crossing. In the theory, we predict, right, because of migrants' utility maximizing behavior, that there's a negative selection of migrant in high-risk, high-rewards locations. Put simply, right, these are workers who have very little to lose by choosing the high-risk, high-rewards location. So what that means is that assessing border sectors with negative selection offers clues about migrants' perception about the relative risk and reward profiles of these border sectors. So observing how they move allow us to figure out more about the risk associated with certain locations of the world, certain locations of border crossing. Right, as we know, direct estimation of the likelihood of discovery and border death is a challenge. Right, we have missing migrants in our observations. Border crossing is more an optimal stopping problem, and so since the direct estimation of these things is difficult, perhaps we can use migrant behavior to help us infer what's going on. In terms of the evidence that we present, we would be looking at 3 types of shocks: individual earning potential, permanent income shock, as well as temporary income shock, to see how that might have affected a migrant's likelihood of choosing a riskier sector to migrate. What we find is that between 1980 to 2005, migrants view Tucson, Arizona as a high reward and high risk location because, in fact, low education level, low-income individuals, such as those that are impacted by the dismantling of trade wars through NAFTA, the erection of border walls, work together to compel poor migrants to select these riskier border crossings. All right, so with that said, so let me see, did I miss something? All right, so that's it. So some of you might be asking yourself, well, you said you put together a theory. What is this theory? Are you just making stuff up as we go along? And so I just thought I'll have a 1 page to show you what it looks like. Essentially, we want to look at a problem in which, right, each migrant's problem is being considered. So let's say there are N migrants and K crossing locations. We want to think about conceptually that at each location for each migrant, there's a perceived probability of success, right? And that is associated with the likelihood of being caught, perceived likelihood of encountering an accident, and everything else, namely the likelihood of returning to the origin. We want to think also a little bit about the cost of crossing in terms of the cost of transportation, in terms of how long it takes, what is the distance to the border, as well as any need to incur a loan to borrow money in order to cross the border. And so credit constraint matters as well. And so the details, of course, I refer you to the paper. But having said that, after going through the analysis, we find that the following is true. And this is the one thing that I'd like to focus on today. Right? And that is that the odds of K over 1. So a migrant will prefer, right, crossing at location K as opposed to some baseline location 1. For poorer households, all else equal, if and only if the risk plus reward combinations of this crossing location K is higher than the baseline location. Right? So in other words, there's negative selection of migrants in risky locations, as long as these locations also offers higher likelihood of success, a successful crossing. So having said that, we use a very rich data set to test this hypothesis. And so we use individual migrant history from the Mexican Migration Project. It is a large data set collected through many years of effort. So in these observations, we see full migration history of household heads, spouses, and family members. So a number of things to note here, and so that reduces the size of the data set that we use a little bit. We use only data on first crossing, right? So oftentimes you see people coming and going, particularly for circular migration. And for those who migrate for the second and third time, of course, history matters. And so we use data on first crossing only. We use migrants of 18 years or older so that it is their decision as opposed to maybe their parents' decision. And that leaves us with about 2,500 individual migrants across 9 possible choices for each migrants, right? And so that leaves us with 22,000 observations. These migrants come from 150 Mexican communities and 38 US, going to 38 US states. Some caveats to note about this particular data set. As I mentioned before, there are more circular migrants than permanent migrants here. Because the surveys typically look at rural areas with high migrant concentration as well. The survey also oversample illegal rather than legal migrants at first crossing, as you can see. And in our study, I think this is actually advantageous because it allows us to look at individuals who are most mobile and therefore most susceptible to changes in border conditions. All right, so just to take a look at the summer statistics, it will be just a few more slides, and then we'll be looking at the results soon. And so in terms of education, a typical migrant has 6 years of education, is crossing at around the age of 28. A very small fraction of these migrants are female. Many of these individuals have U.S. connections in the sense that one of their relatives has been to the U.S. So on average, each migrant has at least one U.S. connection. Right? So that's kind of what the data looks like. And so I also want to present to you how the crossing patterns look like over the years. And so this starts from the year 1980, all the way to 2018. And so as you can see here, these are coded in different colors. And so the blue part indicates the fraction of migrants that are crossing from Mexico to the US through the San Diego sector. And the yellow part indicate the fraction of migrants that cross the border through Tucson, Arizona. And so as you can see here, right at this point, right, this is 1994. It's a very, very momentous year where many things happened at the same time. We had the Mexican peso crisis, we had NAFTA, as well as a couple of border operations, including Operation Gatekeeper and so on. So lots of things happening. And suddenly we see a huge increase, right, in the fraction of migrants that are crossing through Tucson. And so I have a number of other variables as well. And so I am being mindful of time. I think I'll skip detailed explanation of these. I'll just mention that I have characteristics of these border sectors that should have a common impact. Namely, if border enforcement is increased, it should deter any migrant from coming. If the distance between the migrant's location to the border sector increase, it should have a negative impact. So it doesn't really matter who you are. But then there are also characteristics that should be alternative specific as well. And these are basically proxies of individual earnings potential, permanent shocks to the individual's earning potentials, and idiosyncratic shocks to the migrants' earning potential, such as rainfall shocks and so on. All right, so I'll come back to these if there's a need. But here are the main results that I'd like to maybe just talk through here. These three are what we would expect, namely Operation Gatekeeper and so on of San Diego decreases the probability of crossing through San Diego by 0.2, increases the probability of Tucson crossing and El Paso crossing respectively by 0.13 and 0.04. Right, so this is what we should expect. You know, if you put effort in the border, of course, there would be a deterrence effect. Similarly, an increase in the distance required to go to a border sector will also decrease the likelihood of crossing that sector. Right, but that said, in terms of individual characteristics, what we find very robustly is the following: that there is negative selection in Tucson relative to San Diego. That is that we always find, right, that it's only the poorer migrants facing negative income shock in a permanent way that choose Tucson relative to San Diego, right? However, we nonetheless find a positive shock, a positive selection effect when these effects are temporary. So for example, if suddenly I have a negative rainfall shock, so suddenly last year I have bad harvest, what happens? Well, these migrants, because of a reduction in savings, are not therefore able to cross through Tucson, because crossing through Tucson is actually a very expensive proposition. Right? So through that, we infer that Tucson is perceived as having a higher reward and risk profile relative to the San Diego sector. Important to note, this result disappears after 2008, right? This negative selection effect, right? The poor selects Tucson, disappears after 2008, and that essentially is because after 2008, the Secure Fence Act, right, put renewed effort in securing the border in Tucson, Arizona itself. All right, so having said that, so I just want to conclude in this paper, we want to ask the question, why do migrants embark on dangerous border crossing journeys? So unlike, right, the typical way we think about climate change and migration, where migrants, escape these very hazardous climate conditions, this is a case where migrants actually, go into these locations where it is very dangerous. Why is that? And so we looked at 3 types of triggers: border enforcement triggers, individual level triggers, as well as community level triggers. So we have a model suggesting that there's a possibility of negative selection into the dangerous border crossing locations, and we talked a little bit about why. So it also, and if we confirm that in fact there is a negative selection, that in fact that might be offering us clues about migrants' perception about the location whereby there is high reward as well as high risks. And so our policy conclusion in this paper is that border enforcement that increases the relative success likelihood in high risk sector, right? This is precisely what we do when border enforcement is reactive. We just go to where migration were. And so when border enforcement happened this way, we pushes migrant to high mortality, high risk sector, which in turn disproportionately increase the likelihood that poor migrants engage in risky border crossing behavior. And so that's kind of my part of the presentation. I look forward to any questions and comments and just suggestions that you might have. And I'll give the baton to Filiz now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Nancy's talk touched upon how trade and policy infrastructure actually affects migration routes and what kind of migrants are most likely to be affected by that. And in that paper, we're using formal mathematical models, driving implications of these models and testing it with data. In this part of the talk, we're going to see a different set of methods being used, in part because this is an interdisciplinary team of scholars. So I want to acknowledge in this part of the presentation, Nancy, Amanda Rodewald, who's in the Department of Natural Resources, as well as the students who pretty much took the lead in their respective parts, Mario Molina and Julia Zhu. So in this paper, we're looking at how weather changes and their particular combinations and sequencing affect who migrates from Mexico to the United States. So we're looking at it more from an individual's perspective and community perspective, rather than kind of these bigger changes in trade and immigration policy. So as we know, there's more and more interest in how environmental factors might affect human mobility. And the context of climate change, as Vanessa mentioned in the beginning, is in part the context for that, is the reason for that, because we expect extreme events to increase both in frequency and severity in the future. And research in recent years has focused mainly on weather fluctuations, so gradual changes in temperature and precipitation, and has tried to link these changes to human mobility. There's also important work that's done using sudden onset events like disasters or storms and see their impact on human mobility. But here we're considering more the gradual changes and how those gradual changes affect both temporary and permanent migration decisions. And some of the findings we have in this literature are quite intuitive and consistent across studies. For example, Kaiwan Munshi, who's an economist, was one of the first to link rainfall patterns in Mexico to migration decisions out of Mexico to the United States. So he found that low rainfall led to more migration, and the mechanism he proposed for that was lowered crop yields. And later on, as Nancy mentioned, Fang and colleagues basically established this mechanistic link. They connected rainfall to crop yields and then to US migration. So this seems to make sense. But then increasingly, we're collecting findings that seem to conflict with one another. For example, Rios Mena and colleagues looked at the Mexican setting again, and they wanted to study how these patterns varied across communities. So they found that low rainfall is linked with higher US migration, but they only saw that in well-off communities. And the interpretation was that these communities that are more resourced can afford to send their migrants. But then when they looked at extremes of temperature, they observed the opposite pattern. So higher and higher temperatures were associated with more migration only in poor communities. So basically we have conflicting findings even when the same study. And this is kind of an indication of a larger pattern in the literature. We are collecting a lot of mixed findings on the link between weather and migration. And part of it is because we don't exactly know how to theoretically link weather to migration changes. First of all, we're looking at communities that have dramatically different normal temperatures. So very hot weather in a typically hot place may not mean much, but very hot weather in a typically cool place might generate a huge impact. So we want to control for the baseline in a community, the baseline temperature, the baseline precipitation. And studies do that very differently. So there's no established way of doing that, and that changes the results. Second, we don't know at what lag we will observe weather changes impact. Is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? So are we observing this kind of delayed response? And how many years do we have to go back to get the full picture? Again, we don't have an answer for that. Third, we don't know if the response gets stronger or weaker over time. Let's say you had 1 year of bad weather. Maybe you can kind of weather that, but then if it happens over 2, 3 years, does the effect suddenly become bigger? This is what we would call intensification. Or do we observe the opposite, that as bad weather becomes more and more common, do communities adapt to this and find different solutions? So again, all of these ideas would require a different kind of test, and the studies that use these different strategies end up with different results. So what is the solution to that? What we're seeing here is that the impact of weather fluctuations on migration can be characterized by, first of all, complex interactions between weather now and weather in the past, and it would occur over several lags. And second, we would expect interactions between weather and other factors, like how vulnerable a household is, or how well off a community is, or how much past migration experience a community has. Now, the point is, we would like to consider all of these complex interactions, but then our data may not be enough to achieve that. So basically, imagine you have 50 different indicators that you want to control for. If you want to consider all possible combinations and interactions between those variables, you suddenly end up with more parameters in a model than observations. And then even if you were able to fit this really complex model, it's possible that you're basically explaining your data really well, which is known as overfitting, but then your model does not really generalize to other cases. So you want a model that explains not only your data, but it can actually also explain other things or other data sources in the future. So basically, to get around this issue of, first of all, not knowing what indicators to include, not knowing what kind of interactions to include, we turn to recently developed methods in computer science. So these are the machine learning tools that are part of the artificial intelligence toolbox. And these models are very good at fitting really complex models without overfitting the data. And I'll explain in a little bit what I mean by that. So machine learning is a growing field at the intersection of computer science and statistics. And it seeks to automate this discovery from data. So if you think about intelligent systems, in the past, these systems coded the output for every possible input. But nowadays, these tools are actually using complex functions to estimate and to learn from data. And Mario and I actually started out by writing a review paper on the use of these methods in the social sciences. And there we talk about 2 different classes of methods. And I'm not going to go into the details, but what we're doing in this paper is known as supervised machine learning. So basically, you're taking a set of inputs or indicators or variables that you think matter for the outcome, and you're trying to use those indicators to predict an outcome. And in our case, that outcome is migration. So this is kind of, these represent two different cultures of looking at data analysis. And I don't want to go into the details, but in typical statistical estimation, we have a set of variables, X, and an outcome that we want to predict. And we want to find a way of linking these two. And in this new kind of line of methods known as supervised machine learning, instead of kind of looking for these particular linkages, you're using very complex, often non-parametric models. This means that models that you can't really write out as an equation. And then you're trying to, find a model that gives you predictive accuracy. So anytime you're using Netflix and it's suggesting you new movies to watch based on what you watched, behind those are these predictive algorithms. So basically, we're asking, can we use these methods to see if we can predict migration? Now, the question we're asking, first of all, is can we predict it at the individual level? And second, can we predict it better if we factor in weather? So basically, the method that we're using is based on the so-called regression trees. So imagine, a tree-like model that splits into different parts. And at the end of each branch, you have a prediction. So I kind of have a very simple example here. So let's say you want to predict migration using two indicators of age and education. So you can imagine a tree first splitting your sample into two by age, young and old. And then each branch might further split into two by education. And then at the end of each of these branches, you have a prediction. So in this case, we have young college graduates migrating and everyone else not migrating. Now, what we're doing is basically taking thousands of these trees estimated from our data and averaging over them. So this method is known as random forests. And it's known to kind of lead to more accurate predictions compared to just a single tree. But the downside is even when you predict things really well, you don't exactly know what your tree looks like because you've averaged over so many trees. So it doesn't give you much of an insight into how your X, your inputs are linked to your output. But again, our goal here is to understand, can we predict it? And the data, I'm not going to go into the details since Nancy described it so well, but it's basically the largest data source available on Mexico-U.S. migration. It's very good at capturing, especially undocumented crossings, and it has time coverage from 1980s to today. So we take this data at the individual level, where we observe each individual over time and can tell exactly when they migrated, and what their family structure, what their income looked like, what their education was. And then we overlay on this data weather information from the NASA Earth Observing System. So again, this is at the very fine scale, 1 kilometer squared grids on the entire surface of the world. And we basically take each community's boundaries and average over these grids to kind of get these daily temperature recordings. And we match it with our survey data. So one point that I want to make, and I'll make this quickly, in the literature, we see a lot of the times weather measured at the state level or the municipality level. So in this kind of entire project, we spent a lot of time trying to get weather at a finer scale. And we weren't sure if this was going to pay off, if this was going to create a big difference. But here we're looking at a simple kind of depiction of what a difference it makes. So here we're looking at precipitation values compared to a baseline in Mexican states on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we're seeing the same figure at the municipality level. So you can see immediately there's a lot more variation when you look at it at the municipality level. And in the study, actually, we're looking at it at an even smaller level of the community. So this, we found, makes a huge difference. Basically, looking at the state really kind of obscures the little differences across communities. And this is an important point that we're making here. Okay, so basically what we want to predict is first migration trip to the United States. And the things that matter that we know from the literature are things like your age, your sex, education, how much wealth your household has, and then your community characteristics. Are you living in an agricultural community? What's the migration history of that community? And then when it comes to weather measures, we basically include everything that we can think of, everything that has appeared in the literature. Remember, these machine learning tools are especially good when you provide them with a lot of indicators to select from. And the idea is that the algorithm will select the most, predictive variables. At least, that was our hope. And we're including many, many, many lags for each community. And we're hoping this will give us some predictive power. Now, one thing to note is that in typical statistical estimation, we try to fit the data as best as we can. So we use the same data to select our model and to also evaluate its performance. In these kind of new tools, machine learning tools, the goal is to predict out of sample. So you basically have to gauge how well your data is doing outside the sample you use to kind of fit it. So you separate your data into different components, and that allows you to test how well you're doing. So the data that you use to fit your model is known as the training data, and the data that you use to validate it is called the validation data. And then there's a separate data that you don't touch until the very end of your study, and we haven't seen that data yet. Okay, so we have about 140,000 individuals in the data. About half of them go into our training data, and the remaining half we split between validation and test data. So can we predict migration? Now, if you're really naive about this, you immediately say yes, and you predicted really, really well, but then that's because of the imbalance in the data. So remember, we have annual observations for each of our 140,000 individuals. So this gives us over 2 million person years, and there are only 20,000 migration events, less than 1% of the observations. So if you build a model that predicts no migration always, that's accurate 99% of the time. If you kind of relax this, if you consider this imbalance in the data, you actually quickly realize that you can't predict migration at the individual level really well. Well, you actually do okay in the training data. So the training data is the one that the algorithm first starts on. Here you're seeing, your prediction rates. So we can predict non-migration events 100% of the time, and we can predict migration events 87% of the time. So pretty accurate. But this is only in the training data. What happens if we have our algorithm or model and have it, predict in the validation data? And there our performance is terrible. So we're predicting migration, non-migration 99% of the time, but we're predicting migration only 6% of the time. So really terrible, which means we're overfitting the training data. Now, to avoid this overfitting, we put some constraints on how complex our model can get. So basically, we're telling our model not to capture the idiosyncrasies in the data and focus only on the more significant signals. And we also change the relative price of making mistakes for migrants and non-migrants. And that actually improves our predictions quite a bit. So here we're making it a lot more costly, like 1 million times more costly to make a mistake in migration predictions than it is to make a mistake in non-migration predictions. And we see that our accuracy moves to 50%. Okay. What happens if we select the best model out of all of these? And how well can we really predict migration? And can we predict it better with weather data? So this is known as the ROC curve. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically on the y-axis, you have the true positive rates, the times your model correctly identifies a migration case across false positive rates. Obviously, if you have a perfect model, the curve would jump right up to 1 and then stay there. And then you look under the area of this curve, and the higher the area under the curve, the better your fit is. So basically, these different curves are all corresponding to different models. When we don't include any weather data, that's the red curve. If we introduce different weather indicators, the other colors, you see that the curve jumps up, so the area under the curve is slightly larger, but not by a whole lot. So basically, our best model has about 80% accuracy, and with weather data, it's about 80 to 81%. So the weather does not seem to make a huge difference here. So we can predict migration, but not that well. And then with weather, we can do it a little bit better. So what about if we asked an expert to pick the indicators that mattered the most, and we compared the simple model to the most complex model that the algorithm could go for. Again, the results are not that different. Now, what does this tell us? These findings, the unpredictability of human behavior is actually a pattern that's emerging. There was recently a big competition that was done at Princeton where the researchers provided data, to social science data to researchers to try to predict individual outcomes out of. And 160 teams competed, trying kind of really, really complex models. And what they found was the predictions were not really that accurate. And even the best models did not do so much better than a simple model with expert chosen indicators. And I wrote a commentary on this effort that appeared in PNAS. And in that commentary, I made some points that I think apply to this case as well. So what does it mean that we can't really predict individual behaviors like migration? First of all, our surveys might be missing key aspects of people's lives. So we ask people about their education, their income, but maybe we're missing more important things that push them to migrate. So this is a question about like, what else can we be measuring? Or we might say that life outcomes at the individual level are too idiosyncratic. So as social scientists, maybe we can kind of connect aggregate patterns. Maybe we can detect these aggregate patterns, but we can't predict it for each and every individual. So these are all on the downside. But on the upside, our existing approaches, carefully chosen, carefully specified models actually perform quite well. So maybe we don't need to kind of all quit and let computer scientists do our job for us, but the domain knowledge that we have actually really matters. So in the second part of the paper that Julia Zhu is spearheading, we're actually taking this exact approach. We're trying to use our domain knowledge and trying to specify a model carefully and see what kind of things we can detect on the relationship between weather and migration. Now, where does our domain knowledge come from? Obviously, the literature, but also our field work in Mexico. So in 2019, with support of Atkinson Center, we did field work in Mexico, and we talked to the coffee producers in Chiapas, and coffee is one of these things that is really affected by changing weather, as well as corn producers in Jalisco. And Jalisco is a region in the central west of Mexico, and it's one of the biggest senders of migrants to the United States. So we wanted to see kind of how things were changing for people. So here are some of the things that we've learned through these interviews that we did. First of all, and this is not surprising, weather is a lot more unpredictable now. And this is obvious to farmers there, both to corn farmers who mentioned that they would know when it would rain and they would prepare for it, but now they can't. As well as coffee farmers who talk about the same thing. They knew when to prepare their coffee plants. They knew when the summer would come. They knew when the cold would come. But nowadays, it's all a guessing game, and they can invest a lot and then lose a lot based on that. And then this was really important to us. Weather comes in different combinations. So here a coffee farmer is saying there was a change that now it rains, and when it rains, it gets hot. It used to not get hot. In other words, if we were looking at the effect of rainfall over time, it would change in part because rainfall is now being combined in different ways with temperature. This means that we need to look at the interaction between temperature and precipitation changes. And farmers are acknowledging that bad weather reduces harvests. They're making this direct link, and poor harvest is leading to debt because they need to invest. And when they can't recover their investment, that means they're indebted for the next year. So the effects might last for a few seasons. And then many of them brought up migration as an alternative, especially for younger people. When the crop yields are low, people migrate. But they actually also recognize migration is costly. What Nancy's presentation was talking about, especially out of the less risky areas, migration is really, really expensive. And they're indebted due to poor harvest, and they cannot afford to migrate. So how about we incorporate all of these insights into our analysis and come up with a really well-specified model? So here, our model is trying to predict, again, the first US trip. And our main indicators of interest are precipitation and temperature last year, as well as 2 years ago, because we want to consider sequences of weather. And then we also control for a bunch of individual household characteristics and also things that are specific to a region and a time. So we introduce these dummies to control for that variation. And here are how some of the insights from field work feed into this model. We include interactions to understand how different combinations of precipitation and temperature matter. We also consider the full spectrum of weather events, right? So in the literature, people typically look at bad weather events, when you have very low rain or very high temperature. But we think that maybe kind of controlling for good weather is important because that's when you can save money for the coming years. And then we compare each community to its own normal. So we're not just kind of using temperature at the absolute level, but we were looking at temperature in terms of its deviations, like place-specific deviations from their normal. So we're looking at the effect of changes. And then we're introducing interactions across time, like sequences of events. So if there's 2 years of bad weather in sequence, what does it mean? Or is good weather one year making up for bad weather another year? So we're kind of trying to get into these kind of combination and sequence of events. And then we test for heterogeneity by household wealth status. So Nancy's presentation highlighted how poor and wealthy households were impacted differently by policy. So we want to test for that. Are poor and wealthy households responding differently to weather? Again, we're using the Mexican Migration Project, only focusing on rural communities because the assumption is agriculture is the main mechanism. And we use information from about 56,000 individuals here. And then our focus is on migration trips between 1991 and 2018. We defined the 1980 to 1990 period as the normal period. So we're computing deviations of weather in each community from that period. And then we compute all weather indicators as deviations from the baseline. And we're considering both good weather and bad weather events. So we have different categories. And good weather would be wet weather and cool weather for corn production. And bad weather would be very dry and very hot weather. So what do we find? Basically, combinations of rain and heat really matter. In other words, if we only looked at rainfall, as Munshi's study did, or if we only looked at temperature, we would be missing an important part of the story because these things matter increasingly in combination. And we find that both good and bad weather can be predictive of migration flows. And we find strong results on heterogeneity by wealth. In other words, rich and poor households do not respond to weather in the same ways. And how so? We find that rich households are migrating when last year's weather is bad. So whenever there is a negative shock last year, you see this positive migration response out of wealthy households. So here we're just showing 2 coefficients from our models. And we see that when it's very hot and dry, or dry and very hot last year, wealthy households are increasingly more likely to migrate, but not poor households. We see that poor households migrate when last year's weather is good. So when it's wet and very cool last year, and this gives farmers an opportunity to save money, that's when they can send out migrants. Now, when we look at sequences of weather events, so when we consider 2 years ago and last year, this picture becomes a little bit more clear. We see that poor households actually migrate when weather has been bad 2 years ago and good last year. So you experience a negative shock, you can't immediately migrate, you're poor, you have to save, and when it's followed by good weather, that's your opportunity to save, and then you migrate. Now, what do we learn from this? We see clearly that migration is an adaptation strategy to weather. And as Nancy mentioned, a lot of this migration is temporary. So these migrants are going to the US and coming back after a while. But this adaptation strategy is available only to rich households. They can respond much faster than the poor. And poor households can respond only when unfavorable conditions are followed by favorable conditions. Otherwise, they cannot migrate due to high costs of migrating. And then considering this combination and sequencing is really crucial in understanding this link between weather and migration. I also want to say kind of the first part of the talk, like both of these predictive models and carefully specified parametric models can be helpful in understanding first, like in predicting migration without clearly establishing the linkages, and also kind of establishing the linkages so that we can think about preventative strategies for the future. So I'll stop here. I'm sorry if we went for too long, but yeah, we're looking forward to getting your questions.
Filiz and Nancy, that was fantastic. Thank you. Nancy, if you want to come on with us as well. Those were two incredibly rich and detailed presentations. Thank you so much. I learned a ton and took many notes. We have about a half an hour for questions, 25 minutes for questions, if you two are willing to answer some live. To the audience, if you have questions, please do go ahead and submit them in the Q&A. And somebody 20, 30 years younger than me figured out that you can upvote, which means that you can press the thumbs up on a question, and that means that it will rise higher in the rank. Right now, there aren't as many questions. So, but if you like a question, then give it a thumbs up and we'll make sure that we try to answer it. Nancy and Filiz, let me start with a question that echoes one that Fessy Kellis also put in the Q&A and asks you about your data set, this incredibly rich data set from the Princeton Mexican Migration Project. There, you know, the way that you go about examining the data and using this particular data set is wonderful because it really foregrounds the agency of the migrant, right? Rather than focusing on, say, the actions of the Border Patrol, it really looks at the reason why people make decisions and puts that first. We're wondering about the sort of decision making that goes on that's more qualitative and might be difficult to capture from a large scale data survey like this. And in particular, what role do emotions play, affinities with partners or networks, social networks in the United States? You talked a little bit about gender, but maybe you could talk about that more in terms of married people who might be crossing and thinking about crossing with a partner or for children. Can you talk a little bit about how some of that kind of qualitative data might factor into the studies you're doing?
Filiz, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to talk a little bit about this. So I've been looking at this data in different ways until now, until we got the support from the Cornell community and we all got together. So until then, and in my book, it was all about these other factors that mattered to migration, how family, life stage mattered to who migrates and why. And the typical pattern that we see in Mexico is in the early 1970s, late 1960s, the migrant profile is very much male, and it's very much young adults with new families, people who have just married and they're looking to build a house. They're looking to kind of earn some money so that they can come back to Mexico and invest in that amount. And we also see migration coming out of communities that sent braceros, this labor agreement between Mexico and the U.S. that covered almost 20 years between 1940 to 1965. Certain communities became hubs of migrants. So you see this history mattering. You see this kind of rite of passage type of thing. You're planning to marry or you're just married, and then you migrate, you earn some money, you come back. But then this pattern starts to change as Mexico changes, right? So increasingly there are more women migrating. And then during crisis periods, you have, younger people migrating, children migrating in the 1980s and 1990s. And, as Nancy's talk mentioned, as the border changes, as migration becomes riskier and riskier, then you have a younger and younger profile of people migrating, people who can take these risks, who can weather kind of the difficult journey. So it's definitely, our analysis did not show it, but there's definitely a lot of variation, both across time and across different regions of Mexico here. But despite all of these things, I think the exciting thing, which I didn't expect or didn't know going into this, weather still kind of matters, and bigger policies still matter in how many people migrate.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would just add by saying that, the role of gender is very important and however, I think still very much understudied. in the sense that, migration within the family tends to take place in sequence, right? So perhaps the husband would go first, and then if it was successful, then the wife may or may not follow. And then how the wife's migration decision in turn depends on climate change, right, is yet another question that is unanswered, because there are certain tensions, right? The two tensions. One is that household migration, you want to maximize well-being and so on, but it also is for the purpose of risk diversification. And so you want, perhaps one person in both places. And so the question of understanding how climate change might push still, maybe the wife to follow the husband or not. But not to completely disregard the fact that, in fact, even in the U.S., climate change is taking place too. And that is one complaint that I do have about, maybe not anymore after what we've done, about the migration literature with climate change. And that is that, we focus a lot on source country climate change variables, without realizing that, in fact, in the US, climate change is taking place, and it is affecting US agriculture as well. And so how climate change in the US affects the wife's incentive to come. Maybe at some point the risk is so big in both places that, just go to the place which on average you earn higher income is where you want to go. And so that requires a different type of data set, because in this data set we can't do this analysis, right? We can't track who is going when, for how long, and so on. So there's so separately, the US Department of Agriculture has a data set called it's called a NAWS data set, a National Agricultural Worker data set, in which something like that is available. And so we're starting some work on that, but please stay tuned.
So that leads me to ask another question about the data, which is that the number of households, I think you said, Nancy, at the beginning, that are included in this data set would be close to 28,000. And then the data set that you are able to draw from, once you pull just those first-time crossers, that's closer to 2,000, so just under 10% of the full possibility. And I wonder what you two would say would change if you were to query the entire data set. Would the decisions made by second and third time crossers, would that look similar to the decisions you're seeing with first time crossers?
Yeah, so in fact, that's a really, really, really excellent question. And so if you look at, right, so in fact, that's a big part of why we picked looking at first time crosser, because second time, third time crosser typically pick the same crossing location as the first time when they cross, when the same person crossed the first time. And so there is also spatial correlation too, with respect to where you cross, right? After all, to some extent, you want to minimize distance. And so those correlations are there. It is unfortunate that we only get 10% of the data set. And the reason really is because, there's a lot of missing observation in terms of where you cross. It's just, you just don't know. And that contributes to part of the missing data as well. Yeah, but the entire data set has still nonetheless a lot of rich information about where you're from, where you go. And so that is what Filiz is leveraging.
Yes, so I mean, there are different parts of the data. So the data that Nancy is using is the most detailed part, where you have questions on how many times it took to cross, and where you crossed from, how much you paid. So it's very detailed, and it's available for a small portion of the data. The data that we're using in the second part is kind of everything. 140,000 individuals, 20,000 of them have migrated once. So in a way, Wendy, we're looking for a strong signal, right? So it's basically, we're stacking the deck against us, right? So if weather could impact you to migrate for the first time, not knowing what it's like in the US, that's a really strong effect. I would guess, we haven't looked at this yet, in repeat migrations for the second, third trip, it would be much easier to detect this weather effect, because people know and they've done this before. So it would be an easier response. So in a way, the fact that we're observing this with the first migration is quite significant, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Let me pick up on David Kay's question in the Q&A and ask for migration that isn't necessarily crossing a border. People who might, before they cross the US-Mexico border, might migrate internally or might only migrate internally. Do you think that you would see the same impact of weather, or would it be more pronounced because there would be fewer risks potentially to such a migration?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And initially, when we started, we thought that's what we would observe, that internal migration response would be a lot bigger. So a lot of internal migration in our data is happening within states. So it's relatively rare for people to go to a different state. So if you live in a small village in Jalisco, you basically go to Guadalajara, not to another state. And we basically, in our model, the results for internal migration are a lot more idiosyncratic. We can't detect the kind of patterns that we're observing with international migration, which came as a surprise because a lot of the literature, which is based on much smaller data, finds that internal migration is the first resort, which makes sense. But in this case, we're not really observing it. One thing that might be specific to this data is the data that we're using are not representative of Mexican population at large. So basically, the surveyors went to communities where US migration was at high levels. So we're basically selecting communities with a significant history of US migration to begin with. So it might have to do with that. Maybe census data might reveal different patterns, but for our data, we're not seeing the internal migration story.
I wonder if Vanessa would be willing to come back on and ask a couple of her questions.
Hello, yes, and I'm back and I'm in Zeus. I did have a couple of questions. Professor Chau, I was wondering if the effects, you were mentioning a little bit about the 2008 border fortification policies and the effects of that on where migrants would cross into the United States. And I was wondering if there was maybe any evidence or any information on the years since 2008, and particularly when we're taking into account, I guess, increased rhetoric of border fortification. Has there been any changes in anticipation to that and where migrants might cross the border into the United States with regards to rhetoric?
Thank you, Vanessa. Very good question. So, so after 2008, the data, the number of observations dropped off significantly, particularly observation with information related to where the migrant crossed, and so for that reason also. We don't want to, I don't have too much faith on just relying on that a small number of observations to draw strong conclusions. So that's one issue. But another point to make related to what you said just now is that, in fact, whereas the border enforcement, building a border wall policy is more recently heard of, right? It's something that we hear of more lately. But it's something that has started. The first mile of border wall was built in 1993, 94, right? So since then, every year, some wall is being built. Sometimes 1 mile, sometimes 13 miles. Every year, it's been going on. And so, in fact, we included some of that into our analysis too. It has this standard effect of deterring migrants where it is built, right? But there is one in the economics literature anyway, one study that specifically focused on the impact of the Secure Fence Act. And there too, they looked at the impact on migrant deterrence as well as migrant displacement. And so those effects are as you would expect.
So I'll just mention one thing. So one of the unintended consequences of building more, obstacles on the border is it's forcing migrants to stay longer and longer. because now it's very costly to migrate, because there are fewer regions that are riskier and you need to hire someone to help you cross. And increasingly the smugglers are part of organized criminal organizations in Mexico. So the cost is rising. So to recover these costs, you actually have to stay longer in the United States. So the average trip used to be less than a year in our data in the 1970s and 80s. Nowadays, it's around 3 years or more. So that's the unintended consequence. When we're making it harder to come here, you're also making it harder to go back.
Thanks, Vanessa, and thanks, Nancy and Filiz. A question from Alfonso Cuevas: as weather patterns or climate forecasting becomes more difficult, weather becomes more unpredictable, do you see people who are migrating, will they begin to, or will they disregard weather more and more as it becomes more difficult to predict?
No, I'm not sure. So one thing that we're doing as a follow-up to this project is, once people migrate, once people are in the United States, when are they coming back to Mexico? And how does weather in between? Let's say you left your community, the weather was bad. How are you watching the weather there? And when are you deciding to go back? So we're looking at that, but as it becomes more and more unpredictable, I'm not sure how it's gonna. I think part of it is the unpredictability is also what they're responding to, right? So we're not looking at absolute weather changes. We're looking at how many standard deviations are you off, and the more standard deviations you're off from your normal, meaning that the more kind of unusual the weather is, what you're used to, the stronger the response. So I think higher variation would mean, I would guess, based on what we know, higher response. But the other thing, Alfonso, could be maybe people adapt and, stop doing weather-dependent things like agriculture. So that's the other strategy. In that case, weather would matter less.
Thanks. A question from Braden Preston, which he says might be a little bit outside the focus of your research. He's wondering if you've seen any data on the rates of remittances changing in relation to climate variation, or any other aspect that you've looked at in your research.
We haven't looked at it for this project, but I think it's a great idea. So the general pattern out of Mexico is, women migrants tend to remit more. Less educated migrants, more temporary migrants tend to remit more. And there's some work done by Dean Yang, not in the Mexican setting, but other settings, that shows whenever there's a climate shock or an economic shock, the remittances increase as a response to that. So, we could probably, expect those patterns, but the literature also talks about how remittances are related to your intentions to return. So to connect back to Alfonso's point, if it's really unpredictable, if you see no hope of returning back, if also the border enforcement makes it unlikely that you can imagine going back because you can't imagine coming back, then maybe remittances will also slow down eventually if people decide to build their lives in their new country.
Thanks, please. I had another question that I wanted to ask you. This is a question for Nancy, maybe also Filiz, but it takes off of your presentation, Nancy, where you were showing us the numbers of international migrants and then the number of migrants specifically due to climate change. And there was a suggestion that a climate-friendly scenario, maybe for the next number of years, would result in a dramatic decrease in the number of migrants. And that seems to be slightly at odds with the research that you two have found, that maybe that connection between weather and migration decisions, while there and significant, is maybe not quite as large as we might have thought going in. What do you think about that number? What is a climate-friendly scenario for migration, and will it have that outsized impact?
Yeah, thanks. So as Filiz would, I'm sure also, well, I shouldn't speak for Filiz, might agree that these estimates are sensitive to where you're doing it, how you're doing it, the scale at which you're doing it. The World Bank result is based on a worldwide gravity model estimation, whereby you put in source country variables, destination country variables, and these climate friendly scenarios are also based on hypothetical climate change scenarios that are developed by climate scientists, right? So unlike unlike what we have done, where we just look at experienced climate change and therefore and find out what is the best fit. These are hypothetical situations, and so it is hard to directly compare. And certainly, one thing that I think many of us who study climate change migration become aware of is that the external validity of each individual country level analysis is something that we should be mindful of. What happens in Mexico may not happen in China, and vice versa. And so I think when you read the World Bank report as well, they're quite careful to say that these are estimates. But the point being, right, that the direction of the change is something that we want to talk about, and that is that if we remove the very reason why people are migrating to begin with, naturally you would expect there to be perhaps less migration. I think that fact per se may not be that disputable. What we find, however, is the juxtaposition, right, between whether a climate change shock that we observe is a permanent shock or is it a temporary shock, right? Both might be going in the same direction, but they will have very different kind of behavioral responses depending on whether or not the credit constraint binds. I think that's something that we both finding.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And the FANG study that we both refer to, which is one of the most well-cited studies on this, they estimate 6.7 million in the next decades. But somebody else took their data and redid the analysis with a slightly different specification, and that estimate disappeared basically. So so these are very sensitive. And I think one of the strengths here is we're looking at the individual level data. And we have a lot of variation across communities. So this is actually, I think it gives me more confidence than papers that take aggregate results, country level results or country level numbers and try to connect it to country level changes, because there's just so much variation there. So I think, fine-grained data really matter.
Filiz, can you talk I know we're almost out of time, but what do you think is the future for machine learning modeling? Has it proven to be powerful? And given that you've done work that also really looks at more qualitative indicators, talking to people, asking them how they make their decisions, what do you think about the possibilities for integrating that or the power of the machine learning modeling vis-a-vis that?
Yeah, so I'm not the expert on this, but so I think I was very hopeful starting out, because I thought here's a situation where we have more data than we can process when it comes to weather, because we have daily information, measured at this very kind of high granularity. And here's a perfect, migration data set, one of the biggest that we have. And if these models are predictive, like they should be predictive here, but it turns out, not really. And the results are not specific to what we're doing. The competitions that I've mentioned, they also find this result over and over again. And I think nothing is going to replace careful thinking and understanding the domain and the context that you're studying. Even when you're using those methods, the more you know about your setting, the more informed you are when you're choosing these indicators, the more you understand what you're putting in, I think the higher chance that these will be helpful. One area that I find them really helpful is that sometimes we're overly optimistic about how well our models fit, because we take our data, we fit our data to that, setting. And then we're really happy when we explain the variation. But we might also be capturing a lot of the idiosyncrasies of our data. So I think it's a good idea to set aside some of your data to see what you fit here on this portion also fits on this other portion. So it's actually teaching us to be a little bit more careful in what we do. And I do see this not as kind of, one or the other, but I think we will need both of these approaches here. So although it wasn't a very successful effort in this case, I think we learned that our measures are not really covering everything about people's lives. So we have a lot of things that we don't understand, which is helpful.
This is self-interested to say, but it does sort of support the thesis of this series, which is that having an interdisciplinary perspective that gives you a grounding in the history, in context, in the geography, in the legal structures, and the kind of work that has been done from a quantitative and qualitative perspective, that can give you a really robust sense of why it is that you might be seeing the sort of dynamics that you're seeing, whether in the qualitative work or in the quantitative work. Thank you two so much for joining us. This was fantastic. We really appreciate the presentation. And thanks to all the people who are listening. We will see you next semester.
Thank you.